possible to on time. I invite you to open your class books to page 17. Page 17. And then open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. We're going to continue looking at this episode in Matthew's Gospel, what we call Matthew chapter 2. Last Sunday, we looked at the big picture ideas of Matthew chapter 2. Let me get there on the slides. There we go. So last Sunday, we looked at the big picture ideas. What are those main things that Matthew is communicating in what we call Matthew chapter 2? And it's these four that he's using this episode in Matthew 2 to establish the Jewish rejection of Jesus. But also at the same time, not just the Jewish rejection of Jesus, but also the inclusion of Gentiles in the Messiah's community who are represented by the Magi. Another main idea of what we call Matthew chapter 2 is that Jesus fulfills the Hebrew Scriptures. And we're going to be looking at that in more detail today. And then finally, the fourth big idea that we discussed was that the events in chapter 2 are illustrating this major theme that Matthew is communicating in his gospel: king and kingdom of heaven versus king and kingdoms of the earth, or kings and kingdoms of the earth. And that dichotomy between what the kingdom of heaven is all about and how it is the polar opposite of the kingdom of heaven, that is a thread that you'll see run throughout Matthew's narrative, and we'll see that more again today as well. So those are the big ideas of Matthew 2. We also talked about three important details that in Matthew 2, Matthew gives us three details that communicate and emphasize that Jesus is king. We have the idea that he's born king of the Jews, in contrast to Herod, who is a usurper. We have the star. So that star that leads the Magi to Jesus. We talked about how in the Jewish mind, that was a symbol of kingship. It's not just a random thing that God chose to lead the Magi. It symbolized the promised king from Israel that was prophesied in Numbers 24, verse 17. And then we also talked about the detail that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and that connects him to David. And we'll say a little bit more about that today as well. So if you have your class book, at the very bottom of page 17, we're going to pick up our examination of Matthew 2 by looking at a couple literary features, and then we'll start examining Matthew's use of the Old Testament in Matthew 2. There are two literary features that I want to focus on. Because remember, Matthew is writing a narrative, and so he uses literary devices to communicate meaning to us. The first one, like I said, is at the very bottom of page 17, and it's this idea that Matthew uses foreshadowing here. In chapter 2, the event with King Herod and his trying to kill the real king of the Jews, and the fact that Jerusalem is troubled at the news that the king of the Jews has been born, Matthew's using foreshadowing here. He's foreshadowing the fact that in the story of God's Messiah, Jerusalem is not the place where the Messiah will be welcomed. Ironically, the place where you would think the king of Israel would be welcomed is actually the place of hostility for the king. And even though we talked about that a little bit last week, let me show you an episode that Matthew includes later in the gospel that's a parallel to what we see in Matthew 2, so you can see how Matthew is foreshadowing all of that. Turn to Matthew 21. Turn to Matthew 21. And what Matthew gives us in Matthew 21 is, like I said, a parallel episode. So in Matthew chapter 2, the Magi come and say, hey, the King of the Jews has been born. We want to worship him. Where is he? And Jerusalem is troubled at that news, that the King of the Jews is born. And Jerusalem is the center of that opposition to Jesus, because Herod, the reigning king of the Jews at that time, he tries to kill Jesus. Well, then Matthew gives us this later episode in the story that's a parallel, and you can see how Matthew's foreshadowing this. In Matthew 21, what we call the triumphal entry, what's happening in that? The triumphal entry, what is going on? When Jesus enters Jerusalem, what is he hailed as in Matthew 21? What's he celebrated as? What do the people from Galilee call him in Matthew 21? Look at it in verse 9. So look at Matthew 21, verse 9. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Now, this is a story of kingship, just like Matthew 2. Where is he who was born King of the Jews? Matthew 2 is all about Jesus' kingship. In Matthew 21, it's all about Jesus' kingship. He's now entering Jerusalem, and for the first time in the narrative, he is allowing himself to be hailed as the king, the Messiah, publicly. And look at the next verse in Matthew 21. What is Jerusalem's reaction to that? Look at chapter 21 of Matthew and verse 10. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowds from Galilee said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. Do you see the parallel between this episode and what Matthew's told us in chapter 2? What Matthew's foreshadowing? The Christian Standard Bible translation says the whole city was in an uproar in Matthew 21. The ESV says the whole city was, what's it say? I've now forgotten what it says. Stirred up. Stirred up. And it's a different word Matthew uses, but it's the same idea. In Matthew 2, King of the Jews has been born. Jerusalem is troubled. In Matthew 21, the king is entering Jerusalem, and they're in an uproar. They don't join the crowds and celebrate the arrival of the king. They're stirred up. In fact, they don't even recognize him. They say, who is this? And then keep reading. Look at chapter 21 of Matthew and start reading with me in verse 14. And the blind and the lame came to Jesus in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. What Matthew is foreshadowing in chapter 2 is that Jerusalem is not going to be the place where the king is welcomed. It's the place that is hostile to Jesus as king. And these same Jewish leaders that are indignant at Jesus being hailed as king, what will they then do at the end of this week in the narrative? Same thing Herod did. Let's try to kill him. Now they succeed because Jesus lets it. He lets it happen. But they try to kill him. They are Herod. And so what Matthew is doing in Matthew chapter 2 in telling us this episode of the Magi and how the Jerusalem was troubled and they don't go to worship the king, only the Magi do. He's foreshadowing the very thing that he's going to develop and then reveal later. Jerusalem is the place where Jesus is in danger. It's not the place where he's welcomed. In fact, just flip a page or two over to Matthew 23, and Jesus himself will make this explicit. The point comes to the foreground here in Matthew 23. Look at the very end of Matthew 23. Start reading with me in verse 37. Look what Jesus himself says, and this is what Matthew is bringing out in narrative form. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And so again, I'm just pointing out that this point of Jerusalem being a place of hostility to God's chosen king is foreshadowed in Matthew 2. He is establishing that theme at the beginning so that he can then return to it at the end. What questions or thoughts do you have about this literary feature, about Matthew using foreshadowing in chapter 2 to develop this idea of Jerusalem and its hostility to Jesus as king? What questions or thoughts do you have? There's one more literary feature I want to point out, and this one to me is just fascinating. In fact, it has been a constant source of food for thought, just never ending. The second literary feature, and this will be on the next page in your book, page 18 at the very top. We talked a few weeks ago about how Matthew bookends his narrative with the idea of God with us. And it's at the beginning of God with us, and then it's at the end where Jesus says, "I am with you." And so there's this development that God with us becomes Jesus with us because he is the physical manifestation of God. But there's another bookend in Matthew's narrative. And it's this idea of King of the Jews. King of the Jews. King of the Jews is also a bookend to Matthew's narrative. He brings it out at the beginning, and then he returns to it at the end. There are only two places in Matthew's gospel where he uses this title to describe Jesus, King of the Jews. One is in chapter 2. Where the Magi come, and it's a title of honor. Where is he who was born King of the Jews? We've come to worship him. Where is it then used again later in Matthew's gospel at the end? You remember? Crucifixion. Go to Matthew 27. Go to Matthew 27. Note the return of this title, King of the Jews, but note how it is used in chapter 27 compared to how it was used in chapter 2. Look in Matthew 27 and start reading with me in verse 29. Actually, verse 28. Start reading with me in verse 28. "And they," that is the Romans, "stripped Jesus and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!'" Go down to verse 37. "And over Jesus' head they put the charge against him, which read, 'This is Jesus, the King of the Jews.'" And then look at verses 41 to 42 of Matthew 27. "So also the chief priests and the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, 'He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him.'" Now there, the title King of the Jews isn't used. A parallel expression is the King of Israel. And that makes sense, because in verse 41, it's the Jews talking. And they wouldn't say King of the Jews, because they're Jews. So it makes sense they would say the King of Israel, but it's the same idea. So look at what Matthew has done with this verbal link. He's given us the title King of the Jews in chapter 2, And it's something that's honored by the Gentiles, represented by the Magi. And Matthew 2 is a story that's clearly about Jesus' kingship. So when Matthew later in the crucifixion scene brings back that title and emphasizes it, what does that mean about what he wants us to see in the crucifixion? How does he want us to see the crucifixion by using the title King of the Jews for Jesus? The crucifixion is an example of Jesus' what? His kingship. Matthew wants us to see the crucifixion as an episode of Jesus' kingship. The same way that in Matthew 2, it's all about Jesus' kingship. He's the King of the Jews. So then when Matthew brings back that title, King of the Jews, at the end, he wants us to compare these episodes together. They're linked with that title. Again, it's the only two places in the gospel that he uses that title for Jesus. Matthew sees the crucifixion as a story of Jesus' kingship. But it's an ironic story. Just like in chapter 2, we mentioned some of the irony there. Note the irony in Matthew 27. What was worshipped by Gentiles in chapter 2 is mocked by Gentiles in chapter 27, the Romans. Perhaps the greatest irony is the fact that in Matthew 27, Jesus is crucified as King of the Jews by the Jews. In other words, if Matthew 27 is a story about Christ's kingship, then some of the great irony is that he is king. He's ruling, so to speak, from the cross, but it's his own people that put him there. He's a king rejected by his own people. But the other piece of irony in Matthew 27 has to do with what you're doing here today. It would appear that Jesus on the cross is proof that he's not king. That's how it would appear to human observers. That's why the Jewish leaders say, come down from the cross and we'll believe in you. Show us your kingship by coming off of the cross. And yet Matthew is telling us he's showing his kingship by remaining on the cross. But the great irony is that we're here today as Gentiles to worship as king that crucified man. So what was mocked and what was ridiculed in Matthew 27 is the object of our worship here today and every Sunday, from Gentiles the world over. Jews as well, those Jews that believe in him. But if we're using the title King of the Jews, that's particularly appropriate for Gentiles to say. The Jews wouldn't have called him King of the Jews. They would have just called him, like in Matthew 27:41, the King of Israel. But for Gentiles, King of the Jews is the title that the Magi use. It's what the Romans use. But we're here to worship him as that. And so this comparison of what Matthew is doing by linking these two episodes. In Matthew 2, I'm going to give you a story of Jesus' kingship, the King of the Jews. But I'm going to give you the same in Matthew 27, even though it won't look that way. The crucifixion, it is a story of Jesus' kingship, where he is performing his greatest act as king on the cross. And we could note too, again, just this constant source of reflection. Remember how in chapter 2 we talked about the king and kingdom of heaven versus kings and kingdoms of the earth. And how in Matthew 2, it's a story of two kingdoms. The kingdoms of the world represented by Herod, who rule through violence. Herod tries to hold on to his power by trying to kill the King of the Jews. We have the same thing in Matthew 27. It's a story of two kingdoms. The kingdoms of the world represented by Rome, who crucified Jesus as an impostor and to show their power. Anyone crucified, it was Rome's statement, we're in charge. And here's what happens to anybody who gets in the way of our authority. And yet, when Jesus is on the cross as king, he is showing us this is what the kingdom of heaven is all about. And look at how different it is from our notions of power and privilege and how the kingdoms of the world rule. And so I'll just say this to close this point. This is maybe an application we can take from internalizing all this that Matthew is doing by linking Matthew 2 with Matthew 27 through this title, King of the Jews. If the crucified Jesus is our king, what does that say about our earthly notions of power and privilege? If the crucified Jesus is our king, what does that say about our country's worship of the idea of my individual rights, my rights, that our country just emphasizes and worships? What does the image of the crucified king say about that ideology? And what does that image of the crucified king say to us about the changes that we need to make to ourselves to align to what the kingdom of heaven is all about? How do we need to change ourselves to align with that kingdom? What questions or thoughts do you have about this literary feature of Matthew where he links chapter 2 and chapter 27? He kind of bookends his narrative with this idea of King of the Jews because he wants us to see both episodes as examples of Jesus' kingship. What questions or thoughts do you have about any of this we've discussed? Yeah, Cordell.
I think it should make us reflect that it's more than about what's going on in earth. That we got to worry about taking up our own thoughts.
Yeah, it should make us reflect on a whole lot of things. But yeah, make us reflect on whatever we see the kingdoms of the earth doing, how antithetical it is to how the true king, who at the end of the gospel, remember Jesus' closing line, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. The true king of the universe. It should cause us to reflect on how he rules. And what does that mean for us as a community who are supposed to represent him as king compared to all the kingdoms of the world and the things that we see them doing? Yeah, Andrew?
Jesus came as an orthodox way.
Yeah.
He didn't come like he invented.
Yeah.
You know, the superhero, boom. He came in such a way that nobody could even believe it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, for 30 years, he had to keep it a fully secret.
Yeah.
Then his ministry comes. He showed the leaders of the Jews all his power. So they were really mocking him. They said, if you're the king of the Jews, come on the cross.
Yeah.
Okay, they were just mocking because they knew what he could do. Why do you think they wanted to kill him?
Yeah.
Okay, it was about control.
Yeah.
They wanted to control, and they were trying to control him even on the cross. The patience that Jesus has, I'll never understand.
I know.
Because it's like, he knows who he was, he knows who he is, he knows who he's going to be, and yet he still lets these people walk on him like a welcome mat. He's better than me, obviously.
Yeah. I know. All of his kingly power, if he was like the kingdoms of the world, he would have used all that kingly power to just smite these human beings and just show them who's boss. But he's sitting there hanging on the cross, showing us this is what the kingdom of heaven is all about.
But if he wouldn't have done that, the problem is we wouldn't have the salvation that we have right now.
I know. We wouldn't have any of the salvation if he'd have been like the kingdoms of the world. But he's not only showing us what the kingdom of heaven is about, he's showing us what God is all about. Because remember, he's God with us. And so he's showing us this is how different God is and his rulership to what you see in the world from these earthly kingdoms. It's amazing. It's a constant, that's why I said at the beginning, this whole idea of seeing the crucifixion as an example of Jesus' kingship that Matthew brings out, it's just a constant source of reflection. I mean, there's just so many things to think about here. It's just a never-ending source of riches, theological riches for us to explore and align ourselves to. Well, let's go ahead and move on to our final section that we look at whenever we look at a portion of text, excuse me, from Matthew's Gospel. We want to note, how does Matthew use the Old Testament, and what Christological claims does he make? Now, Matthew uses a lot of the Old Testament in what we call Matthew chapter 2. He's going to give us 4 quotations. He'd already given us one at the end of chapter 1 with the quotation from Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. In what we call chapter 2, he's going to give us 4 more quotations. We're going to look at all of those. We won't get them all in today. We're going to take a few weeks to do this. But we're going to look at these because Matthew's presentation of Jesus as the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures is a major part of his presentation of Jesus. So if we just skim over it and we say, oh yeah, Jesus fulfilled, okay, he fulfilled that passage. I don't even know where it's at, but yeah, he fulfilled it. Amen. Well, then we're not really understanding what Matthew's communicating to us. We need to go back and look at what passage is Matthew referring to and how is it Jesus fulfills that? Because it's a source of, again, it's just a never-ending source of theological riches that Matthew's inviting us to explore. So we're going to do that today. Before we do, I do need to introduce a concept that is very important for us to know so that we can understand part of Matthew's concept of fulfillment. And it's this term, it's a fancy-sounding term, but it's the term corporate solidarity. Look in your class book at the bottom of page 20. Just flip over a page or two. I have a definition on page 20. I'm going to read it, and then I'll put on the screen a visual to represent it. Part of Matthew's concept of fulfillment is this idea of corporate solidarity. Here's what this means. At the very bottom of page 20. Corporate solidarity refers to the reciprocal relationship between the group and a representative from that group. The representative figure takes on the identity and characteristics of the group, but the group is also affected and shares the fate of the representative figure. So think of David when he goes to fight Goliath. It's not just David and Goliath. David is the representative of Israel, and Goliath is the representative of the Philistines. So not only do they represent their respective nations, but whoever wins, the group shares in that victory. So when David beats Goliath, Israel shares in the victory because David is the representative of Israel. The same idea is utilized here in Matthew. So let me put it up here visually, and then I'll show you a big picture view of what Matthew does. All corporate solidarity means is you have a group of people, and then a single individual becomes the representative of that group. The group's characteristics, their whole identity is assumed in that individual. That individual takes on the characteristics of the group because he is the group's representative. But that individual's fate, he or she shares that fate with the group. And so again, David is an example of that, but let me show you how Matthew uses this concept in how he structures his opening to his gospel. Because remember, this class is about Matthew's opening, Matthew 1:1 to 4:17. Go back to Matthew 2, if you haven't already gone back there. Go back to Matthew 2. Matthew 2, and when you get there, look at start reading with me in verse 14. Look at 14 and 15 of Matthew 2. And Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, you may not know where that passage is from, but you can at least answer this question. Out of Egypt I called my son. What is that referring to in Israel's history? What event from Israel's history is being referred to there? I know you know it, you're just being shy. The Exodus. The Exodus. And so do you see what Matthew is saying here? Jesus, as the representative of Israel, in his individual person, he experiences the Exodus. Now, when Israel left Egypt, what was the next big event where Egypt was truly defeated? The Red Sea crossing. Israel goes they go out of Egypt, and then they pass through the water. What happens in Matthew 3? What does Jesus go through in Matthew 3? His baptism. Exodus in chapter 2, passing through the water in chapter 3, and then when Israel, after they passed through the Red Sea, what was Israel's next event in their history? 40 years of wandering in Matthew 4, in the wilderness. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness being tested. In Matthew 4, what happens to Jesus? Wilderness testing. Do you see what Matthew is doing? He is presenting Jesus as the representative of Israel. And since he's the representative, he in his own individual person will experience their history. He goes through the Exodus. He passes through the water in baptism. He then goes through the wilderness testings. But the key difference is Israel failed in the wilderness, but Jesus is victorious. Jesus beats Satan in the wilderness. Now, if Jesus is the representative of Israel, if he is to be the perfect representative of Israel, what did Israel go through because of their sins as a nation? What happened to them? Well, they died in the wilderness, but I mean later in their history, what was the punishment that they went through as a nation for their sins? The exile. The exile, where they were subjugated by the Gentiles and destroyed as a nation. If Jesus is to be the perfect representative of Israel, he's got to go through the same. Where does that happen in Matthew's gospel? Where does Jesus get subjugated by the Gentile nations and humiliated and destroyed by them? Crucifixion. This gives us another layer to see the crucifixion. Yes, it's a story of Jesus' kingship, but it's also a story of him as the representative of Israel going through the exile. The key difference is Israel was exiled because of their sin. Jesus, as the representative of Israel, he will go through that same punishment, but not because of his sins, because he's bearing the sins of the group in himself. He'll take that punishment. He'll go through it. Now, the reason that I've gone into this idea about corporate solidarity is so that we can understand what Matthew is going to be communicating to us in his opening, but also because it's going to play a role in the very first passage that Matthew quotes in chapter 2, which is from Micah 5. So if we move forward, let's look at this first passage. In Matthew 2, verse 6, Matthew gives us the first quotation from the Old Testament. And it's from Micah 5. There's actually one more, but I'll say that in a few minutes. But the bulk of it is from Micah 5. Let's go back and look at Micah 5 and see the context so we can understand what exactly is Matthew telling us about how Jesus fulfills Micah 5. Because remember, and this is a key idea, I want to repeat this. When New Testament authors give us a few lines from an Old Testament passage, they don't have chapter and verse divisions to give us, a lengthy thing. So what they so often do is they'll give you a few lines to take their readers or their listeners back to that passage so they can explore the context. So let's look at Micah 5 and see what does that passage say in its context and how in the world does it relate to Jesus other than the birthplace of Bethlehem being the birthplace of the king. That's the obvious one, but there's a lot more to it than that. So let's read Micah 5, and we're just going to read the first 5 verses. Micah 5, starting in verse 1. Now, muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us, that is Jerusalem. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore, he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of Yahweh, in the majesty of the name of Yahweh his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. Now let's just real quick, as we did before, in the left column, we're just going to put a few thoughts to help us understand the context of Micah 5. And in the right column, we'll put how that relates to Jesus, how he fulfills everything in this passage. So here's the first point for your left column. In the context of Micah 5, what verse 1 makes clear is that Israel will be subdued by Gentile nations. Israel will be subdued by Gentile nations. That's what Micah 5 verse 1 is talking about when it says that siege is laid against us, and with a rod they strike the ruler of it, or the judge of Israel, that is the king. They strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. It's a metaphorical way of describing the humiliation of Israel and its ruler because they're being mocked and humiliated and defeated by the Gentile powers, Gentile nations. However, then you get to Micah 5 verse 2, where God makes a promise. And this is the verse that's quoted in Matthew chapter 2. Out of this judgment, this is the next point in your left column, out of this judgment will come a ruler in Israel. Out of this judgment will come a ruler in Israel. That's what verses 2 and 3 of Micah 5 are talking about. In fact, in verse 3 of Micah 5, the analogy that is used is a woman in labor. So just as a woman in labor goes through pain, but then brings forth life, that's how God describes what's going on with Israel in Micah 5 verse 3. Look at that again. Therefore, he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. The birth here is the time of victory that will come with that ruler who is promised in verse 2. Now, let's note a couple other things from Micah 5, and then we'll look at how Jesus fulfills this. This ruler, we're told in Micah 5, this ruler will unite, shepherd, and bring victory to God's people. This ruler will unite, shepherd, and bring victory to God's people. At the time of Micah, it's a time of judgment. It's a time of labor pains. But from that is going to come a time of victory for Israel. And this ruler that is promised in Micah 5:2, look at what is said about him starting in verse 4. Starting at the end of verse 3. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. So this ruler is going to unite the people of Israel. Look at verse 4. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of Yahweh. There's the shepherding idea. And they shall dwell secure, for now shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. This ruler will be the one who brings victory and peace to God's people of Israel. And then finally, the last point, and this is the obvious one that Matthew uses to draw our attention to this passage. This ruler will be born in Bethlehem. That's what's promised in Micah 5, verse 2. I want to return to something real quick before we talk about Jesus, for how he fulfills this. Did you notice what was said in Micah 5, verse 1? Did it sound a little familiar to you? Keep in mind this idea of corporate solidarity, where Jesus is the representative of Israel. Look at Micah 5:1, and you just see that line? With a rod, they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. Does that remind you of anything that happens to Jesus in Matthew's gospel? In the crucifixion scene, do you remember? When the Romans give him a reed, and then what do with it? They take it from him, they strike it, start beating it with it. Do you see the theological riches that Matthew is inviting us to explore here? What Israel experienced as a nation, where they are mocked and humiliated and defeated by the Gentile nations, metaphorically described as the Gentile nations taking a rod and striking the judge of Israel on the cheek. Jesus will literally live that in his individual experience because he is the representative of Israel. But again, the key difference is he's not going through it because of his sins. He's bearing the sins of the people, taking it on himself. Well, let's talk about Jesus now. How in the world does Jesus fulfill Micah 5:2? Well, we've alluded to some of it already. Just as Israel is subdued by the Gentile nations, Jesus will be subdued by the Gentile nations. Again, not because he himself is defeated. He's actually victorious through submitting to them. But he will live the whole exile experience that Israel went through. He'll go through the exile of death. In fact, I forgot to mention this. In the Old Testament prophets, they speak of the exile as the death of the nation. Jesus will go through that himself, literally, in his person. And then second, out of that judgment that Jesus goes through, he will come out as the ruler of heaven and earth. At the end of the gospel, remember, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Jesus will come out of that judgment as the one with all authority. He is the ruler who comes out of it. He goes through the judgment to bear the judgment for his people, but he will come out of it as the ruler of all. And then what Micah had said about this ruler, these are the very things that we see Jesus doing in the gospel. Jesus will unite, shepherd, and bring victory to God's people. Jesus will unite, shepherd, and bring victory to God's people. Would you flip over real quick to Matthew 9? Just real quick. Flip over to Matthew 9. Real quick, let me show you how Matthew brings out again this idea of Jesus as the shepherd king, the shepherd ruler. Look at Matthew 9. And look at the very end. Oh, sorry. I'm in the wrong book. Matthew 9, and start reading with me in verse 36. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And so what does Jesus then do? Well, the next verse. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." He then commissions the 12 to go out. Evangelism is a manifestation of Jesus' shepherding care. Hear what Micah had said about this ruler. The ruler will be a shepherd. He will shepherd God's people. Well, then Matthew brings that out in Matthew 9 and says, here he is. Here's the shepherd ruler. And one way that that shepherd ruler brings care to his flock is by sending out his disciples to evangelize to people. In other words, when we evangelize to people, when we care for them and minister to them in the name of Jesus, we are a manifestation of the shepherd king's shepherding care for people. And then finally, the last point in the right column. And again, this is the obvious one. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. This is the doorway through which Matthew invites us to reflect on Micah 5, is that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. He is that ruler from Bethlehem. And so we can summarize it all like this, just with this question. What exactly is Matthew telling us by telling us that Jesus fulfills Micah 5:2 in its context? Well, on the surface, you could say, well, he's telling us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem as Micah predicted. And that's true, but there's so much more to it than that. Think of it this way. Every time Matthew gives us an Old Testament passage, here's what he's doing. He doesn't have time to then elucidate everything from that context for us. He's like a tour guide who's saying, hey, come over here. Let me open this door. This is Micah 5. Go in there and kind of look around and see how Jesus relates to everything Micah was prophesying. All right, but let's go on in the narrative. Like he then kind of moves on. So he's inviting us to reflect on these Old Testament passages, and the quote he gives us is just the doorway into looking at all those riches that are there for us to consider. So here's how I would answer this question. Here's what Matthew is telling us by telling us Jesus fulfills Micah 5:2. He's telling us that Jesus is the promised ruler born in Bethlehem who will grant God's people victory and peace. He's telling us that Jesus is the promised ruler born in Bethlehem who will grant God's people victory and peace. In other words, the real big point that Matthew is saying is not just that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, because by itself, that doesn't mean anything. He's saying to us, Jesus is the one born in Bethlehem that Micah had promised. Jesus is that ruler. He's that shepherd king. He's that ruler who will bring victory and peace to God's people. Now, real quick, for the sake of time, I'm going to rush through this next part here, and then we'll wrap up here and get you on your way. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, Matthew gives us a composite quotation. What that means is he's giving us actually more than one Old Testament passage, and this is not unusual for New Testament authors to do. They don't have chapter and verse divisions, remember? And so what they'll sometimes do is they'll give us an Old Testament quotation that combines lines from different passages so they can take the reader's mind to different passages to reflect on. Matthew does that in chapter 2, verse 6. The very last line of Matthew 2, verse 6 is a direct quote from the Greek translation of 2 Samuel 5:2. 2 Samuel 5:2. Let me just read that to you. You can turn there if you want. For the sake of time, let me just read you the one line, and then we'll start to wrap up here. Here's what is said in 2 Samuel 5:2. It's where David is now being acknowledged as king by the northern tribes of Israel. And here's what they say. 2 Samuel 5, verse 2. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you, David, who led out and brought in Israel. And Yahweh said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. And again, Matthew's last line in Matthew 2, verse 6 is a direct quotation of 2 Samuel 5:2, the Greek translation of it. So real quick, let's fill out that chart. It's just one thing in each column. We'll move through this very quickly. In 2 Samuel 5:2, David's role as king is described as shepherd of Israel. That's how his kingship is framed in 2 Samuel 5:2. David's role as king is described as shepherd of Israel. And so, by including this line, by Matthew's choice to include this passage, here's what he's telling us about Jesus. Jesus is the shepherd king of Israel par excellence. Jesus is the shepherd king of Israel par excellence. In other words, he's the ultimate shepherd king to which all previous shepherd kings pointed, mainly David. Jesus is the greater David, the greater shepherd king who has come to rule God's people. And so the same question, we always kind of summarize it this way. Okay, what exactly is Matthew telling us here by claiming that Jesus fulfills 2 Samuel 5:2? Well, here's how I'd word it, and then we'll wrap up with some applications. Jesus is the Davidic ruler chosen by God to shepherd God's people. Jesus is the Davidic ruler chosen by God to shepherd God's people. A key element in 2 Samuel 5:2 is that the northern kingdoms recognize you, David, were chosen by God to shepherd God's people. So for Matthew, in including this quote, what Matthew is saying is that Jesus is not just king because he happens to be born in Bethlehem. He's not just king because he happens to come from David's line, as important as that is, because he stressed that. But think about it. Other people in Jesus' day were also descendants of David. In fact, in theory, you could have had a descendant of David born in Bethlehem as well. Why is Jesus the one? Why is he the promised ruler of Micah 5:2? It's because God chose him as king the same way God chose David as king. So think about what that means in Matthew's gospel and today. When somebody refuses to kneel before Jesus as king, who are they really rebelling against? Not just Jesus, God, because Jesus is God's chosen shepherd. So to rebel against Jesus as king is ultimately to rebel against God, because God has chosen Jesus as the king of his people. All right, very quickly, let me just wrap up with these points here. If you just give me 5 minutes, I'll wrap up with these applications. What can we take from all this that Matthew's telling us? Here's the first one, but it's not in your book. I added this first application after printing the book, so you can just write it in somewhere there in your book. Here's the first application that we can take from this. Jesus is a ruler who experiences his people's hardships. Jesus is a ruler who experiences his people's hardships. Jesus is a ruler who experiences his people's hardships. This comes from reflecting on what Micah 5 was telling us. Think about it. Jesus, even though he has no sin, he goes through the exile. He allows himself to go through the pain and the punishment of the exile in the crucifixion, even though he doesn't deserve that. But he goes through all of that because he is the representative king. And so if you reflect on that, what that shows us about Jesus is that he is not a king who is isolated from his people. He doesn't live up in a lofty castle where he's just disconnected from the plight of his people. He comes down and experiences our fallenness and our brokenness, even to the point of suffering punishment for our sins, even though he didn't deserve that. We deserve that. That's the type of ruler Jesus is. And that's the type of ruler that he is, and he invites you to come to him as that ruler. Yes, sir. Go ahead, brother.
Spirit, he's sensitive.
Yeah.
He shows the compassion.
Yes.
The openness to people.
Yes.
That you come to him, he knows what you're going.
Yes. He knows what you're going through. He's lived in this human experience. In fact, that gets to our next application, but it's actually the last one in your book. I flipped it. Sorry, I know I'm making a lot of changes here. But here's that next application that our brother is alluding to. Jesus' rule is one of pastoral care. Jesus' rule is one of pastoral care. He is not a Herod. He is not a ruler who lords it over his people, who likes to just keep them under his thumb so they always know who's in charge. He is a shepherd. He is compassionate. He feeds his flock. He cares for them. That's the type of ruler Jesus is. And as you read Matthew's gospel, read it as a story of kingship, yes, but read it as a story of the shepherd king, par excellence, who is caring for his people. And then finally, last one. I just leave you with this question. What reaction does the King of the Jews provoke in you? Worship or mockery? What reaction does the King of the Jews provoke in you? Worship or mockery? In other words, are you the Magi of chapter 2? I want to worship the King of the Jews. I want to bring my treasures to him. Or are you the Romans in Matthew 27? Hail, King of the Jews. Yeah, right. Every time that we as human beings choose to ignore Jesus' kingship, to do what we want to do, to choose sin over what he's commanded, every time we do that, we're mocking his title. You're not really my king. We become the Romans when we do that. And so the question for us then is, what does this King of the Jews provoke in us? Worship or mockery? Well, with that, we'll end today's lesson. I know we went over today. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll look at more of these Old Testament quotations next week. Hope you'll be here for that. God be with you this week.